So in this video we're going to look at just moving the camera around and a few things about the camera in Bryce and putting a terrain in your scene, scaling it and then moving the camera around that terrain. Now I suppose what we could do is put the terrain in this scene to start with and then we'll have some kind of focus. If you switch to the overhead view, now you can switch views from this little arrow here. Now don't do this very often, but it's possible. So from top, for example, gives you this view, and you can get to the main perspective camera. That's the perspective camera there with its field of view. But there's also the director's view, which if you've just launched Bryce and it's got no settings that you've saved in the default file, there's another video about that if you want to search that out, then you will tend to be in the director's view looking at the front of the perspective camera. Now perspective camera, as it's shown in the wireframe, is a pyramid. And as you can see, these dotted lines coming out represent the field of view, and from our view we're looking at the front of this other camera. But I don't find the director's camera, which you'll know you're in the director's camera because you get this little seat there, and you can toggle between the two cameras by just going over that little icon. Then I don't find that view particularly helpful, because when you switch to the overhead view, I use the keyboard shortcut 2, then you see the director camera is somewhere here, but we don't know where it is. If we wanted the perspective camera to go to where the director's camera is, there's a little control here. If you look at this arrow here for camera options, we can send the camera to the director. So if we do that, you now know where the director's camera was. The most useful position, I think, to place your camera if you're beginning is to place the camera here, so just south, I'm going to call that south, of the infinite plane. That's the infinite plane. You only see that much of it on the grid, but it extends in all directions. And if you go to the edit menu, rotate your camera around so you're roughly facing north. Now if you switch to this camera view, which is keyboard shortcut 1, or from here, camera view, if you switch to this camera view, you'll see we're looking over the top of the infinite plane, and if we just go sky fog, here's the sun rollerball control, and when the sun's above, the dots in the middle. When it's to the north, which is in front of us, the dots here, north, you can see the sun. So it makes sense to have the dot on your right is on your right from this particular position, and likewise for the other views. At the moment I've got the horizon turned off. I don't know as a default whether it's on or off. This is the underground view on off in the wireframe. So if I click on this once, you'll see the horizon appears, but it has a drawback. Everything on the opposite side of the infinite plane, on the 0 point, will become invisible, and then you won't see it. You might be able to select it, you might see some dots. So what we'll do at this point is bring in, from the create menu, a terrain. If I want it to come in the default grey material and not a selected material, just hold the control key down while clicking on the icon and a terrain's come into the view. Now because this was the default view, if I switch to the overhead view again, keyboard shortcut 2, you see the field of view is quite narrow. If we were doing a landscape, we'd probably want a wider field of view. If you want to modify the field of view, you can go into the camera view, so keyboard shortcut 1, and there's a field of view control here, and you can modify it just by clicking on it and moving the mouse left and right. So we can widen the field of view that way, or keyboard shortcut 2, overhead view. We can select the camera itself by clicking on it, go to the attributes and modify the field of view in this dialog here. So I want to set this at 120 degrees. You'll notice there's another value, the scale, and that is modified when you zoom in and out when you're in the perspective camera view. So if I check this now and press 1, there's controls here that zoom you in and out, but things get complicated if you use that control in this view. So I'll just zoom in once, twice, and then go to the overhead view pressing 2, and go to the attributes, and you can see the scale's been modified, and you can lose track really between scale and field of view. So I prefer that to be at 100 and not zoom in and out when I'm working from the perspective camera. So keyboard shortcut 1 again, back to perspective camera view, and we'll consider now our terrain while we're at it, because I can show you the thing with the horizon. So the menu's hanging around because of Camtasia Studio. So I'll click on the terrain and I'm just going to lower it, and you can see how it's vanishing until it's completely vanished. There's some dots because it's still selected, and I can still lift it back up again if I can get hold of the control. There you go, lift it up and down, and that is because, I'll just push it so it's half in and half out, we've got this horizon line showing. If I just knock the horizon line out by clicking on this toggleable control, you can see the terrain now shows, but it's a little difficult to tell whether it's buried in the ground or not in this infinite plane. You've got the shadows in the wireframe. You can maybe see that shadow of that if they're turned on. The controls for doing that are like the depth cue, which fades the wireframe. If you click on that and then slide the mouse up and down, you can control how it fades out as it goes into the distance. What's this one here? Wireframe shadows on off. Yes, that was what I was thinking I was going to get hold of. So click on that and the shadows disappear. And we've got the underground on off, and this one here that allows you to modify the resolution of the wireframe for either things that are moving, things that are selected when in red, or when they're just static when they're not selected, so if you've not got something selected. I find the easiest way to select something is to hold down the control key and then click on the thing you want. There was only one thing in the menu there, but if there was two things, then you can select between the two by pressing control and then clicking. I guess we're moving slightly away from our topic here, which was cameras and the positioning of this terrain. So if I switch to number 2, the overhead view, I'm happy to use these zoom controls in the overhead view, and if you need to reposition, there's the hand here, and that allows you to slide your view around. If you use this from the perspective camera, you're going to modify the pan H and pan V options in the attributes, which will change the perspective of the view. I guess that's getting kind of complicated, so just don't adjust that unless you're in one of the orthogonal views, which is like, for example, the overhead view, or you've got from right, left, back, front, bottom. These are all orthogonal views, and you can just pan things around. If you've got something selected and you've not got it in view, if you just click on either the plus or the minus, it will tend to recenter it, so you can find it again. So like if I press minus now, so if for example I'd lost track of our terrain in the overhead view and I couldn't work out how to get it back into view, you could switch to a side view 3. All the views are bound to either 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5, 6, that kind of thing. Then if you switch to one of the other views and you can select it like so, then when you switch back to the overhead view, minus or plus will re-center it in that view, which makes it a lot easier to find. So there's another reason not to use plus or minus, because it does tend to move things around in the perspective view, and then could result in odd perspectives because you'll have moved the vanishing points around. Again, I don't want to get too complicated on that score. Right, this little dialog here allows you to select different types. So if we click on this one that's terrains, we can select our terrain that way. And as far as terrain size is concerned, we're not dealing in absolute terms. It's as large as it needs to be to interact with your sky. So you can see there's the infinite plane. That'll give you some sense of scale. There's the camera, and this field of view, you've got a sense of scale. So make it bigger, switch to your camera view, lift it up and render and see where you are. What you're aiming for with terrains is a sense of scale, and as I said in the other Bryce Basics video, the horizon represents your eye line, so if you were stood here, a figure would be about that tall, which means this is only a hill. So if you want it to be bigger, you need to either lower your camera or make your terrain larger, but also consider if you can get your terrain interacting with the haze. Now you see it's taken on a bluish tint. That will give it a greater sense of scale. So you can then like lower your camera control, although I never mentioned these controls yet, but these are your controls for moving your camera around, so left, right, up, down. I think these are fairly obvious, backwards and forwards. And this one is the rollerball that allows you to pitch your camera around and tilt it backwards and forwards. This little control here might not be quite so clear. It's a banking control, in which case you end up with your horizon tilted. I'll warn you now, there are a couple of pretty obscure bugs where with certain materials you can't render them with your scene banked. So I tend to avoid banking the scene, and it's not that useful anyway because you don't often have it, and you could always render your scene with your horizon straight if you wanted, and then tilt it afterwards in post work in a paint package, and then that will just you'll avoid the chance of having a bug that will crash your scene because you've banked your camera. It's fairly rare though, and you're not likely to encounter it, but when you do, just think on if you've banked your camera over. You can correct all the camera positions from this control and the attributes for the camera. So sorry, I did that automatically without thinking about it. Click on the camera, go to attributes. Z controls the banking control there, so that's brought him straight. If you want him pointing north and perfectly level, then just set the rotations to 0, and that places you looking north. And if you want to find the origin, then you can just set all these to 0, which is quite a handy thing to know because some of the tools load in at the origin. So, and if in a side view, you can just set things back and reposition accordingly. So here we are looking at our terrain, and you can see it's interacting with the haze. And what other options have we got with our camera? Okay, yeah, let's see. The render controls are right underneath the camera, and you can see that we've got selections for certain cameras where you can change its behavior. In this case, the perspective camera is only a free camera. I think the director's view has more options available, so you can change its behavior so it operates like the perspective camera, but I don't think that the director's camera is that useful except for animators who are wanting to watch the position of the perspective camera. So I'll switch back to perspective camera view. We'll have a brief look at these options here. So that's your main render button. That's a clear and render button, which I've never really used. There's a resume render, which if you're just doing ordinary renders, then you can stop your render, save the scene, reload the scene, and it should resume. Or you can stop the render and resume the render, so long as you've not made any modifications to the settings. There's a fast preview mode, which is occasionally useful. It does tend to result in a slightly slightly noisy render with some odd artifacts in it. And there's this option here that sometimes gets selected and you don't notice, and then you wonder where all your textures have gone. Because we've got no textures in this, you can't tell that. So if I give this terrain a texture just temporarily from the library somewhere, let's pick something out. I don't know what that's going to look like. So even though I've given it a texture, it's still rendering grey. Once the textures are turned on, you can see the texture, which is a little bit noisy. So that's just a brief breakdown of what these controls do here and the camera controls. I'm trying to think whether there's anything else. There's this fly around preview. I don't think that's terribly useful now because the computers are so fast these days that it all happens way too quickly. But if you see that behavior, you know what's caused it at least. And I'm trying to think whether there's anything else that I really need to mention at this stage without making things much more complicated than necessary. I suppose linking. Occasionally you might accidentally link, I'll switch the overhead view, keyboard shortcut 2, you might accidentally link your camera to something else. Like there's this linking and tracking. So you can, if I've tracked that infinite plane, the camera will look at the infinite plane wherever it's placed in the view. And likewise, you can just accidentally click on these things and it causes no end of confusion, or it did to me when I first discovered it. If you want to untrack attributes, linking, it's already tracking to the plane, so you can just say none, and that's broken that relationship, and then you're okay. Likewise, you can parent. So if you make an object like this plane and the attributes, and we parent it to the perspective camera, at this point, now if I lift the camera up, the plane will track and stay with relative to the camera. So me turning it is just staying in absolute position compared with that. So that can be a bit confusing if you accidentally click on this control here, it's the one above there, and you accidentally get two things parented together when you didn't intend to, then it does cause confusion. Again, attributes, you can just go into linking and go none, and then that removes that relationship. I even still now, I do sometimes clumsily manage to link one object to another by accident, or track one or parent one. It's a useful facility to know about if you want to position your camera. So if you get completely lost and you need to reset the views, there's a control here, reset views, and that will place you back in this position where you're facing the perspective camera. There used to be a problem with it setting the priority down to normal, but I don't think it does that now, so that's okay. If you've got a multi-core processor, then the priority will just allow things to operate more efficiently. I'm just repositioning the camera so I'm facing north, widening the field of view as a matter of course there. And the other thing you can do if you've changed your skies, and I'll just point this out because it's another mistake that tends to happen that I see quite a few times. You change your skies and you want to reset the sky. If you reset the sky back to the Bryce default, the default it loads in is the original Bryce default sky, not the sky it loads with on the default scene when you launch Bryce. And the reason this is important to know the difference is if you go into the Skylab, in the sun and moon controls, this sun and moon shadows is not just the sun and moon shadows intensity control, it's the global shadow intensity control. And when it's set at 90, that means that 10% of the light hitting all solid objects is travelling right through those solid objects. So it's spoiling your render by using this old-fashioned way of generating an ambience effect. So if you reset your sky, make sure that the intensity is turned up to 100, and then you'll be able to get fully black shadows. And it also means that when you set your lights up for more sophisticated lighting, they'll work properly, and you won't have this problem where you've not got full contrast because some of the light's getting through. And just remember, this is the global control. So if you turn the sun-moon shadows off altogether, every light source you use, except those using true ambience, which uses a slightly different render method, every direct light source you use will lose their shadows. So I'll just turn that back on now. So that's just a way of restoring your lighting after you've reset the sky. Showed you how to reset your cameras in case you managed to lose your camera positions. So if you wanted to position your camera so it was high up looking down on this terrain, you would just wind the Z-axis up by holding your mouse button down and dragging on that, and then point your camera down at the terrain, and there you go. You'll notice that the haze is quite strong here in this view, but you wouldn't see that if you switch to the overhead view, so that from top, for example, and like I say, you can just do minus. Now if we render from above or from any of the sides, if we want to see the terrain, select the terrain and go minus, and it'll zoom out centered on the terrain. You'll see there's no haze effect in any of the orthogonal views. It's been turned off for those cameras. Another thing that used to catch me out quite a lot, I'm getting really to the last things now, is if you manage to make your terrain so large that it's out of the range of the orthogonal cameras, you'll no longer be able to get hold of it. Which may seem weird, but the orthogonal cameras are just like cameras in anything else. So if I've made my terrain huge, zoom back, so it's actually got so big I can't zoom back any further, I can get it to a point where it's actually going to be above the cameras. So even though I can get it in the perspective view, like this, I can select it, there might be orthogonal views in which, like, I can't get hold of it. I'm trying now and it's just gone into the terrain editor. So I've actually made it so big that it's above the cameras and I can't select it. I'm clicking on it, it's not selecting. Select the terrain now from the perspective camera view, which is still possible. Look in the attributes and look at the height value here, which is off the scale, 78,000, let's say, y-axis, so it's 78,000 up, and I switched from to the top view camera, and then there's an edit current camera, so this is my current camera. You'll see the Y position for this current camera is not that high. This is my top camera. So once you've got the terrain above the top camera, from the top camera view you can't get hold of the terrain anymore. It shows in the wireframe, but your camera is actually below that for as far as rendering is concerned. So that's just a little thing that might catch you out if you're scaling your terrains up and you're not sure how big they should be. If you want to reset something back to its default size, Control plus Alt plus any one of these dots or controls, you can scale it back down. Now it looks rather tiny. If you want to get it back to the origin, click on the attributes and reset these values so you can bring it back into your view. So there you go, that brings it back into view, and there it is by the infinite plane. That's where the 0 point is. If you lose track of something altogether and you can't find it, this little drop down here, select options, you can select things that, like the select the camera, that allows you to modify the attributes of the camera that you're in at the moment, which is not that easy to do otherwise. So you can set your field of view there, and when you've done that you'll see the edges of the camera pop into view, and other things like family selection here would allow you to select that terrain, for example. But anyway, I think I'm drifting somewhat off topic and I've gone on for 20 minutes now. So there you go, a brief rundown of camera control, scaling a terrain, and a few other bits and bobs where you might get into some confusion because of the way Bryce works. So I hope that's helpful, and it'll offer some kind of guide as to using the cameras in Bryce 7.1 Pro.